Why were you in South Dakota?
I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
Why
Please
were
say
you in
again.
South Dakota?
We made it in the storage, factories and
Oh, yeah. Oh, the meat. Yeah. I'm sorry.
the agency decided to put me on the hotel because I basically had like, this happened, so I go back to my family.
Yeah, that's
And
smart.
now it's, you see.
No worries. I'm camped out, but I'll do my best.
But I'm like, I'm pretty sure we are. Now, who is this security person? What's that about? I think that they might be here because there was a group. You think they have their own security? I think media. Media. I've seen a lot of media. Oh, yeah. They hiring. Interesting. Particularly CNN, you know, because they got now. But I've seen others. But also, I think that doing like a documentary or something. So they're kind of big. Probably Netflix. Seriously, no, like you're gonna it probably it might be. No, but don't you think? Yeah. That's gonna be like people are gonna sit down and watch the
Do you want me to zoom in when the presser starts? Or you want me to do this wide shot?
I'm glad it was happening. I'm glad we could have
I can cut it.
it. It's good for everyone else who was there to be here.
I got Evan, our photographer, gave me that 95 pounds, but I was like, oh, it looks so better. Did everybody? I don't know how these people
I mean, I thought about it.
It's just like, I don't know. I really don't.
I thought about it too. We were walking up and I was like, I was just like, there's nothing, like, it's just I just thought we were part of it. Yeah, I initially was like, oh, fix it.
Great, thanks, man. Make sure you put that in the social media.
It was workshops, but
You have some tape that can take on my phone.
I don't have any tape. I'm sorry. I don't know.
I bet somebody.
Yeah, one of these union meetings.
You're gonna need a lot. Yeah, see. Oh, I'm sure. That's right. What's that? How far this is?
Talking about getting TV.
The mask is too small.
I
was just telling our dad, but I was telling him how confused everybody is. Like when we're out working, all of a sudden, he's like, really?
Like a bright line. It's really unusual. Not to put too fine a point on it. You're not. He's broadcasting. Oh, yeah.
But the fact that he's physically at the same place, I was like, yeah, he's a great guy.
That's George's sergeant.
And I'm like, everyone's confused because it's like so outside everyone's experience.
Yeah, some days, yeah. Yesterday, though, I did Don't fuck me. Did he? I was kidding. It's like, I'm trying to get his thing off, and it was not good. And then after that, I went, it's, oh, yeah. I mean,
Both.
yeah, you just gotta
I mean, yeah, I like the portrait, but I also want to go see her.
I don't. Are you having anyone around a lot? They are. Yeah, but like they're not going to be out late. I would like. I would almost rather they just send me have me do all this position and they go home. You know, I'm like, I don't know. It's just kind of like feels like it's so gendered in public radio. Like I just did TV
anytime you get a text from John Taggart, it's always just random. Oh, no,
It's fine, I don't really
like right now,
stuff.
no, that makes more sense. It's funny.
It's just like,
That does feel good.
send me that and then when there's like a water treatment test. Oh, the gremlin. Just every in July, I counted. I went to every program. Like I did a conversation with her after, like, and I just was like, you can't attend. Like, that's what they did, like that. So like, I don't know. And but then I was they're all still trying to work for 10 more years, you know, so it's hard to work for us that way too. Well, I don't think so. I mean, they did their cut back. They're not going to fire reporters, they would have.
Public transport police.
Oh, yeah?
No subway.
She's like, oh my gosh, I said, I'm so loud here.
I think it was just last night. He texted me like, I can't get it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what party.
Yeah.
If you're JFK,
Yeah. 100%. Very pretentious, yeah.
subway's not running anymore.
I was talking about
I felt that way too. And I know that
Watching
that was a surprise to everybody. And I'm grateful too. Yes, that's true. Andrew getting any he's not really his brother's really getting take now.
Wow.
It's so that's been stressful too. Like I wish you would have gotten out. Right. Yeah. This year, can't do anything about it. Then there's like calls that.
Cool.
He comes and goes. He's been pretty you know, I've been really preoccupied with this for the last week, and we've just kind of been trying to stay out of each other's way. Because my negativity is you know, I can't, so I feel very much kind of on my own two-year way, but I think your family, your mom, I just wanted to call And so I think I'm going to maybe look up somewhere once this camp arrives, and I'm just going to take it away, you know what I mean? And I just, and it's not that I don't want to be wrong, it's like we're such a and I just, it's like scary to look at the first time. When you've been married for 4 years, we've been together for 7 years. It's been a lot. Oh my God. The thing you have to do with each other is to like promise. And that's what we said. It's like this is a time when we're out of our minds. Every trigger, every pressure. And we're just really one day at a time, and some days we even really hang out. Yeah. Just you do your thing. Because he's at home all the time. Right? So it's 4 months. But I know everything's good. Yes.
If that dude were to sell,
Yes.
would get back.
If they,
Oh my God, it's hot.
he's gonna sell it something. I don't know what
Yeah.
and that's what we were hoping would be a great situation for him. Now we're not, because it's all based on evaluation.
Right.
Yeah. Well, no, so now we have to wait at the end. It's just kind of like, do it on I mean, thank God.
Should I come where you are?
You know, he's really responsible.
I don't understand. No, good.
Sorry,
Where are you? Where are you?
And you know, that's just like,
No, how can they?
they can't.
And you know, and then, remember,
Yeah, that's it. They were like, let's do a package on it. Like, you can stop being worried about
Progress. You should like draw
we need to be just doing just do this. That's people do not want to hear it right now.
like you need like a ruler to hold that against the eye.
last week I never had to
A quarter than a
at all.
piece of cheese and a dollar bill.
Right. But and it's just hard to get people to think outside the box. And so they were yesterday, they would go over and try to track down businesses and talk about how they're building. And I'm like, that's fine, but part of hanging out and creating was supporting some person that's like representative of the community.
I mean, shit, it could be.
And let's have them on, just have them happy about your goals. And I'm like,
That's how we saw it.
That's actually on my like bucket list. Yeah.
Is it?
Kind of. It looks just so ridiculous.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I had a pig.
Yeah.
You guys have a pig yet?
We're going back to the one that was filling. But they're kind of waiting.
I was wondering about like,
Oh, really?
half the time they did.
I don't. That makes no sense.
Automatic adjustment. They had the last one.
That's the thing because they want to see it.
Yeah, I'm available.
The mouse bigger?
And like the prime, they can make primes. So like 35 points.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm having so much trouble hearing you. One more time. Oh, is that a bad idea? I don't know.
On those? Not on those.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, I know. Well, I bet you know it's good if it starts to sound funny.
It'll distort you.
Yeah.
You hold it right up over there. It'll distort you. I got it.
Este man se me está colgando a mí.
Is it long enough? Excuse us. All right, we're good. We're good here. We're good here. I think I'll just need a mic now, right? You want to get one? I think so. Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Yeah, no problem.
WCCO radio in Minneapolis. Minnesota Public Radio.
Audio input.
Although it's part of the Bureau, though.
Is it any word? And my actual
Short of.
Well, I have a staff. I'm going back and forth. We're CNN doing this live, so and we're going to take it back there. So I don't have to fight.
Yeah, I just have to message the guys and said there's no phone box. So you guys may want to really want to do that.
Right. No, she just got back. Just got back. But anyway, the point is,
Someone's
kind of a sidebar, but kind of when you see this shit all the time story.
Get down. Down. Guys, down.
Really?
Down.
It's not going to work now.
Boom down. Boom. Hey, boom down a little bit, please, man.
Move your boom, bro. I'll start screaming. So we don't get any audio.
I'll stay behind.
I'm Attorney Ben Crump, the lead attorney for the family of George Floyd.
Quiet, please.
I'm Attorney Ben Crump, the lead attorney for the family of George Floyd. And recently arriving in Minneapolis is his son, Quincy Mason. He's going to make a few remarks to you. Understand this is a young man who is brokenhearted, and this is very emotional for him. Now, we come here today to this spot to remember George Floyd, who was tortured to death. And so we thank the Minnesota governor for bringing human rights charges against the Minneapolis Police Department, because we absolutely believe that he was tortured in the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life. Witness Donna Williams yesterday, who was the person in the video saying you all are going to kill him, likened it to suffocation, like a fish out of water, gasping for air. The independent autopsy performed by the family concluded that George Floyd was starving for air. He needed a breath. And the ambulance that came here to pick him up from this very spot was the hearse for George Floyd. And so we are demanding justice based on the autopsy findings, but more importantly, what the entire world has seen now with their eyes that they cannot unsee. The autopsy, the medical reasons cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation based on the knee to his neck and the 2 knees to his back that was compressing his lungs, not allowing them to circulate air and blood to his brain. He died because he was starving for air. He needed a breath. And so we are demanding justice. We expect all of the police officers to be arrested before we have the memorial here in Minneapolis, Minnesota tomorrow. Because we cannot have 2 justice systems in America, one for Black America and one for white America. We must have equal justice for the United States of America.
Yeah! That's what we want.
And change is going to come in the tragic killing of George Floyd. And I proclaim, with his son as my witness, that change starts today.
Yeah!
We are confident that Attorney General Keith Ellison is working feverishly to do the right thing. And what is the right thing? To make sure that George Floyd family is afforded justice by holding these officers accountable to the full extent of the law. Each and every one of those 4 officers.
Yeah, we want that.
Attorney General Ellison has a track record in championing civil rights for those who are marginalized, for people like George Floyd, because Black Lives Matter and George Floyd life mattered too. Quincy is going to make a few remarks. I'll try to take a few questions, and then we're going to let him go receive the rest of his family at the airport, and then we will keep you updated. We fully expect there to be an announcement with these officers being arrested, and we will give you the family reaction when that happens. But right now, I introduce to the world Mr. Quincy Mason, George Floyd's son, to say a few remarks on behalf of him and his family. Talk as loud as you can.
I'm here reunited with my family, trying to get justice for my father. And no man or woman should be without their fathers. And we want justice for what's going on right now. And I appreciate everyone for showing him some support and love. I thank y'all for that.
Quincy, we've seen a lot of protests.
It's so emotional. Yeah.
Quincy, we've seen so many protests around the world, including Australia, about what's happened to your father. A lot of people there are protesting about what's happened to Indigenous people of colour in custody in Australia. Do you have any message to them about what has happened?
I just want to thank them for supporting my family and receive justice for this.
How important is change? This is a pivotal moment in our country because of what happened to your father. How important is change? What do you want to see happen?
We need change. This can't happen to anybody else.
Quincy, did you learn about the death of your father on TV like everybody else? Is that the first time you?
No. His family notified him.
We love you, Quincy. We love you, man.
Thank you all.
We love you, Quincy.
Thank you very much.
What charges?
Okay. No, keep it right there.
What charges are you expecting today? What do you expect the three other officers to be charged with?
We are expecting these officers to be charged as accomplices for the killing of George Floyd. And hold on, I'll make sure everybody is quiet and situated. He's not going to say anything. Okay. All right.
Ben, talk to us about what we saw in that
Let's
video.
keep them close. Let's keep them right behind us. Let's go.
Ben, talk to us about what we saw in that video, those three other officers, and why you believe they are complicit.
Obviously, as the police chief said, these officers are complicit by their silence, but we now know, based on the audio from their body cam video, that they also are accomplices because their failure to act when they knew that they did not have a post. Remember, one officer said he doesn't have a post. Maybe we should turn him over on his side. However, Officer Shervin said, no, we're going to keep him in that position. To us, that is intent. And that's why the family is calling for first-degree murder charges against Officer Chauvin for having his knee in his neck. And equally important is the fact that those two knees in his back for not 1 minute, not 2 minutes, not 3 minutes, not 4 minutes, not 5 minutes, not 6 minutes,
That's right.
not 7 minutes, not 8 minutes, but almost 9 minutes. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd begged for air. He called out for Quincy's grandmother. He called out to anybody who would listen. And seemed like the lay people on the street were listening. The people who refused to listen were the people who were supposed to listen. It was supposed to be the police who were meant to protect and serve George Floyd, because George Floyd was an American citizen and George Floyd was a human being. George Floyd deserved humanity. And also, the system needed to be listening to George Floyd. not just the police, but the prosecutors, the criminal justice system, the judges, the legislators, the president. America needed to be listening when George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," because when he couldn't breathe, none of us could breathe. And so this is a tipping point. This is a tipping point. This moment is a tipping point to change America and see if America truly believes in the words of Thomas Jefferson, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, America, that means black people too.
That's right. Say that.
Did that answer your question, George? Okay.
What do you say to
Two quick questions.
What do you say to the other 3 officers who did not intervene? What do you say to them?
You know, the family of George Floyd watched the video in agony. You've seen Philonis, you've seen Rodney, you've seen Bridget, you've seen Terrence, you've seen his children. They are horrified at what they witnessed on this video. I think every human being who has any humanity in them are horrified what they see on this video. The only question is, why weren't those police officers horrified? And so the family's statement to those police officers are they are just as guilty for the death of George Floyd as Officer Chauvin. They all participated. And when people tried to help, the officer took out mace. When Donald Williams and the EMT, the lay witness who were there, they threatened them that we won't let you give humanity. Even though we're not going to give humanity, we won't let you give George Floyd any humanity. And so the message is clear. Do your job to the people who are responsible for doing justice, because all the world is watching. 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 All the world is watching.
A question from the BBC. What do you think of the way the world has responded? What do you think of the way the world has responded, and also how America has responded?
The response of the world has been heartening to this family. Their entire family have been very heartening. They receive it as a blessing that George Floyd's life mattered to more than just them. It is very important to note who George was. There are videos on social media that George believed in peaceful protests. Brandon Williams, who was George's nephew, who was like a father to Brandon, said that they talked almost every day, and during the Ferguson protests, during the Baltimore protests, and just recently during the Sacramento protests, you had George Floyd praying for peaceful protests. You know, the forensic scientists, Dr. Michael Biden and Dr. Alicia Wilson, who did the family's autopsy, said that George died because he needed a breath. And so I am imploring along with George Floyd's family, for all of us to take a breath. For peace, let's take a breath. For justice, let's take a breath to heal our country. And most importantly, let's take a breath for George Floyd as we get ready to memorialize him this week and lay him to his final rest on next Tuesday. Let's take a breath this week to heal the country and to remember George. Let's follow George's example. He would have wanted peaceful protests. He wants everybody to use their voice, but he wants them to do it in a constructive way. So as we get ready to memorialize him on tomorrow at North Central University with all his family, I also want us to remember that Breonna Taylor, the young lady who was executed in the sanctity of her own home in Louisville, Kentucky, birthday would be on Friday. So let's take a breath for Breonna as well. Let's take a breath for Ahmaud Arbery as well. Let's take a breath for Terrence Crutcher as well. Let's take a breath for Pamela Turner, who was killed in Houston. Let's take a breath for Alton Sterling, who was killed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Let's take a breath for Philando Castile, who was killed here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Let's take a breath for Laquan McDonald, who was killed in Chicago, Illinois. Let's take a breath for Sandra Bland, who was killed in Texas. Let's take a breath for Natasha McKinney, who was killed by police in Virginia.
That's right.
Let's take a breath for Stephon Clark, who was killed in Sacramento, California. Let's take a breath for Corey Jones, who was killed in Palm Beach, Florida. Let's take a breath for Botham Jones, who was killed in his own apartment in Dallas, Texas. Let's take a breath for Eric Gardner, who was killed in Staten Island, New York. Let's take a breath for Freddie Gray, who was killed in Baltimore, Maryland. Let's take a breath for Walter Scott, who was killed in South Carolina. Let's take a breath for Jamar Clark, who was killed here in Minneapolis. Let's take a breath for
Tysell Nelson, North Side, Minneapolis. Tysell.
Let's take a breath for Michael Brown, who was killed in Ferguson. Let's take a breath for 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed in Cleveland, Ohio by the police. Let's take a breath for Trayvon Benjamin Martin, who was killed in Sanford, Florida. Let's take a breath for Emmett Till, who was killed in Mississippi. Let's take a breath collectively for all of the marginalized and disenfranchised and dehumanized people, whether black, brown, white, or red, who were killed unjustifiably, who were killed unnecessarily, and who was killed senselessly because they are American citizens, one, they are human beings, two, and finally, all remember, they are children of God. Thank you so much. We will respond to you when we get the announcement.
We've been listening to Benjamin Crump. He is George Floyd's family attorney. He also introduced us to the man you see there in the